so choose to take liberty of it. Number 7, with regard to preaching the gospel, Paul said, "For necessity is laid upon me, and woe is me if I preach not the gospel." Uh, and I think when we think about Paul's statement, I am not preaching the gospel so you will support me. That's not what I'm here, and that's not what I'm about. I preach the gospel of Christ. For me, it is a necessity. I have that ability. I am an apostle. That's what I must or I should be doing, regardless of whether I'm being, and I think this is the thought in mind, regardless of whether you're supporting me or not, I'm preaching the gospel. I have known preachers who preach and don't take money. I have known them. But if they chose to be supported by a congregation, they should be. So I think that's part of what Paul's statement is about. And he said, the latter part of that is, he said, "Laid upon me, and woe is me if I preach not the gospel." Listen, he knew that he had that responsibility. And it would be dangerous if he skirted it or if he chose not to do what his calling was. You remember when he met Jesus, and he would go into Damascus, and it was said of Paul that he was going to do what? What was he going to be? What was it?
He would send him far against the Gentiles, but he also said in Romans 1, verse 16 or 15, or verse 14, I'll get it right. It's time that the debtor, both to the Greeks and the barbarians, both to the wise and the unwise. I think he felt a debt he owed.
He did.
This message due to persecuting Christ, or that's my view. How many Christians he would have perhaps even condemned to death, prison, and so forth. I think he felt a real debt to go out and preach. And in my view, I think that's why the necessity is there. He just felt that he owed that.
Can you not imagine his feelings? Having done what he had done prior to becoming a Christian, makes very, very logical, isn't it? That he felt such a great indebtedness to do so. So what was the reward which Paul spoke of in this chapter? He spoke of a reward. What was that? Anybody remember? Did he talk about a crown? As a matter of fact, that crown is heaven. That's the reward. And he spoke of receiving that crown. So that's the answer there. Then again, what did Paul think? Well, let me see here. Yes, what did Paul think might abuse his power in the gospel? What could have gotten in his way? Could his rights get in his way? And I think that's what the answer here is. Paul says, he has the rights to do all things, but sometimes all things aren't expedient. And that's the same thought or the same idea. Just because I have the right to take funds from a congregation, that doesn't mean I have to. It may be the wrong thing at the wrong time. A fledgling or a young congregation just trying to get itself established. So I can see that. I've done some gospel meetings where I simply just told the people I didn't want money. Sometimes money's not everything. We have responsibilities, we have duties, and we ought to look at other people and their situations in life. And there's a question regarding that as well. And we ought to act accordingly based on the totality of what we know about what's going on in the lives of other people. And that would include congregations. And I think Paul had that in his mind. And so his rights, just because he had the right doesn't mean that he's going to do it. And that was his same feelings, evidently, on marriage, isn't it? I have the right to be married, but I don't have to be married. It's not something that I'm commanded to do, that I absolutely have to do. Question 10, why had Paul made himself a servant to all? Well, I think this applies to every Christian. He became a servant to all that he might win all. His desire was to win as many people to Christ as he could. He wanted to gain for Christ. Then again, you think about how much damage he had done. I guess there's an amount in his human mind, an amount of thinking about retribution, trying to correct things or to make an atonement for things that he had done in his past. And I don't know about you, but as a Christian, I often think about those very things. What I have done to hurt the church, and it makes me to want to work harder, to do more, or to do better. Any comments here? Okay. What were some of the things that Paul did that he by all means saved some? Well, Paul basically said that he became a servant to all. To the Jews, he became as a Jew. So what does that mean? Did he practice Judaism? No, he did not. But he would ceremoniously cleanse himself. He was a Jew. Why? That he could enter into the temple, that he could teach, that he could preach. Trying to get on the level that they're at, trying to gain access to people, it is very, very important. I won't call him by name, but there's a preacher in this area. Last I heard, he still wore overalls, white shirt and overalls, preaching from a pulpit. That probably wouldn't be something you'd do at C Street. But at the congregation he's at, even more country than we are here in this congregation, it's very, it applies, and he did that to become like they are, to gain their trust, to gain their acceptability of him. So to the Jews he became as a Jew, to the unconverted Jew, that is, and then to the Jewish Christians, he tried to, I think, get on their level as well. There were still some Jewish Christians who were observing some of the rights or the requirements of the old law. When Paul would have Timothy circumcised, that would be one way that Paul would become like the Jews, in order to gain access to them. Not that it's a law of Christ, but to allow himself and others to be able to teach them. To the Gentiles, he became as the Gentiles. Perhaps not presenting himself as a Jewish person. Again, trying to get down on their level, or up on their level. I don't mean to disparage them in any way, but to get on their level, whatever that level was. And I think today we do the same thing. In teaching the gospel, especially if you're on a one-on-one situation, what the very first thing you've got to know? You've got to know where they're at. You've got to know where a person is or you ought to know where they're at before you start teaching. And sometimes that demands that we ask questions in a very kind way. We've got to learn where people are at before we can teach them. Number 12, in this chapter, Paul compares the Christian life to two things, verse 24 and verse 26. Let's read. Verse 24, know ye not that they which run in a race run all, one receiveth the prize, so run that ye may obtain. And every man that striveth for the mastery is tempered in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible. So Paul here has mentioned a runner, one who is in a race, perhaps one who runs marathons or whatnot. And then verse 26, I therefore so run, not just wildly running. Paul says, I have a goal in mind. There's no uncertainty in this. There is a goal, and I want to attain it. And then he says, so fight I, not as one that beateth the air. You've seen a boxer stand in shadow box. That's what this should bring to your mind. And sometimes that boxing seems sort of aimless. I like to watch boxing, and I've seen some amateurs that just throw punches in the air because they really don't know what they're doing yet. You want to be like a trained boxer. You know, you have a goal and be certain about what you're doing. And so he brings up this runner and a boxer. And verse 25, he binds them together that every man that striveth for the master is temperate in all things. So when we think about being temperate as a runner, as a boxer, I have to have control. I have to have control of my body. As a Christian who is running the Christian race, I must be in control of me. If not, I'm going to fail. And so I think that's the idea. As a matter of fact, the English Standard Version says it this way: every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath or a crown, as the King James Version says. And you know, that's the goal. You want to win this title. Listen, that's a great goal to have. If you're a runner, if you're a boxer, that's fine. That's what you're doing this for. But keep in mind, there is another battle, there is another race, another fight, where you can win an imperishable crown, one that doesn't decay. And that's eternal life, of course. So that's the idea here in verse 24 and verse 26. Then, through 26. 13, what should happen, or could happen rather, to Paul, even though he preached the gospel? Well, Paul said that even though he preached, in verse 27, that he could become or find himself as a castaway. The idea of being a castaway is one who has been disqualified. You know, you're on a ship and the ship is sinking. We need to get rid of 15 people. If your number is called or your name's called, guess what? You become a castaway. You're thrown overboard to save the rest of the people. And so that's the idea here. Let me read from you, or for you, from the English Standard. Paul said, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others I should be disqualified. And I think that's the idea of being disqualified, if we think about the word castaway. Let me read here. Thayer says, you're one, or this refers to one who has not stood the test. So Paul says, I do these things. I buffet my body, as he says in the Bible. I run the race with certainty. I run the race with a goal in mind. I do all these things so that when the time comes, I do stand approved before God. You know, you look at a boxer, you look at a runner, someone who's won an Olympic gold. Well, the proof of them attaining that goal is the medal itself, right? Well, there's not going to be any medals in heaven. The proof is gaining heaven itself. That is the medal, that is the crown or the gold or the wreath, as the English Standard Version says. Okay. Any comments?
Just an opinion.
Okay.
When Paul said verse 27, the King James rendered, but I keep under my body. The word keep under, according to Mr. Thayer, I think this is metaphorically as well, but to be black and blue, to smite so as to cause bruises and livid spots. I think the idea that he's presenting that it's difficult. The self-discipline that is needed, and again, discipline, the self-control to monitor our lives and to put in action what we know is right, whether it be omission, whether it be commission. But I just think that's the battleground that we face, is the discipline day in and day out, each moment, each hour, each day, week, month, year, to do what we know is right. And Paul said, but I buffet my body. Read the text again, but I buffet my body and bring it into subjection. In general, I think it's easy for us to become lazy, not just physically, but spiritually as well. And I think that's the battleground that we all face.
I agree with you. That word is found two places in the Bible. The other place is Luke 8:15. The other time it's found in the Bible. And it literally, as I was looking at that today, it means being hit in the face under the eye. Well, where does he like to hit? Well, there's all kinds of body punches, but it seems like the head's the target. And if you get in a fist fight with somebody, I don't know if you've ever been in a fist fight. I know as a child growing up, I was, and I didn't target anything but the face in those little scraps that I had. And I've even came home with a couple of bruises under one or both of my eyes. And that's the idea here. And Paul says, I do that to myself.
Yeah, I don't mean to suggest there is a practice where people would inflict self
Not physically.
pain. No, I know that.
Yeah.
There is a practice where people, for penance sake,
Beat themselves or injure themselves.
that
There is.
would take and, again, do terrible things to themselves and inflict pain. I don't think that's what Paul said at all. Metaphorically, symbolically, I think he's saying that's how difficult it is.
It is difficult.
We have a saying, I have to beat myself up sometimes. Meaning, again, do what I know is right.
Do you have to beat yourself up just to keep yourself in line sometimes?
I think
That's what he's saying, and David's exactly right. We got to watch ourselves. Okay, Deuteronomy 25, verse 4 is where the next answer comes. What Old Testament scripture did Paul quote and say that it was written for our sakes? And that's not the right one. I wrote down the wrong one. Anyone put down the right answer there? Well, I messed up, and I apologize. I saw my mistake as soon as I read it. I'll see if I can find it in a minute.
Was it the law of Moses?
Is it 25:4? Well, that's not the right one. It's for our sakes. Huh? Okay, I'll come back to that and try to correct that. Let's do number 15. Though Paul preached the gospel, he had nothing to what? Nothing to glory. Paul understood that the glory was not for him. I think it's in verse 15. But I have used none of these things, neither have I written these things, that it should be so done unto me. For it were better for me to die than that any man should make my glory void. Listen, Paul didn't have anything to glory in. He wasn't not taking money so people would think that he was something great. Nothing that he wrote that he said was to bring honor or glory to him. It was simply to present the truth of the gospel, to help the congregations or the churches in years to come, including us. To what do the words incorruptible and corruptible refer? Well, corruption implies the possibility of decay, of becoming of no effect, of being destroyed. I was watching a home repair show, I think it was last night, and they had made this piece of furniture, and a statement was made that it would last forever. Well, I know what he was saying. This is a piece of furniture that's going to last for decades if it's taken care of. But does a piece of wood last forever?
No, eventually it'll rot.
It's going to eventually rot. Right?
That's why it's gonna burn.
One of the two, isn't it? If it doesn't rot, it will burn in the end. And so I think that's the idea. And I'm glad David said that, because this applies to spiritual things. We don't want, there's nothing wrong, rather, with winning physical titles or crowns or reaching goals. But the goal we should be wanting to reach is the spiritual goal of heaven, because that is a crown that is incorruptible. It cannot be defamed. It cannot be destroyed or taken away from us. The works of man cannot destroy that once we've received it. Satan can no longer touch us once we gain that. And so Paul, as well as us and the church of the first century, it is all of our goals to work hard to attain that spiritual goal. All right. If Paul preached the gospel, this is number 17. If he preached it, how? The King James says, if I do this thing willingly. He says, if I do it willingly. Another version says, if I do it freely. I'm not charging you for it. I'm not trying to reach or gain compensation. He said, I had a reward. He said, I've got a reward. But if against his will, if he is forced to do it, he had a dispensation of the gospel committed to him. For dispensation, the Revised says, a stewardship. Listen, the idea here, I think, is regardless of how I do this, there's going to be a reward. When he talks about a dispensation of the gospel committed unto me, he's talking about I have been entrusted to preach the gospel. I have this office, not an office of power or an office of that thinking, but a responsibility, I guess, has been laid upon me. Was it a responsibility laid upon him because he's an apostle? No. Because he's a Christian? Yes. A Christian first, an apostle second. So I engage in the work that I engage in. And if I do it because somebody's compulsing me to, because God's forced me to, or some person is trying to make me do it, then there is no reward to it. Paul says, I do this. And listen, shouldn't we be Christians out of our love for God? Shouldn't we do what we do because we love God? Some of the things that really disturb me about us as Christians, we're asked to do something, and, well, why can't somebody else do it? Our first response should be, if I have the time, if I have the ability, if there's a way I can fulfill the request, I ought to want to do it. Isn't that what Paul is saying, basically? That he wanted to do this? So many things I guess we could say here. Anyone else have comments on this one? This is a good verse. If I do this thing willingly, what is his reward? Well, I think the rewards are multiple.
Given the context of where he's talking about payment, receiving things, and again, as you well pointed out, he doesn't say that's wrong at all. But suppose that's the only reason I preach. Well, if I don't preach, they won't pay me. I don't want to preach, but I want money. I think that would apply.
Yeah. And Paul says, I must preach regardless, though.
It's true.
And I'm going to preach regardless. And I think David's right. It does fit here very well. If I don't do what I'm supposed to, I'm not going to get paid. So anyway, a lot of ways you can look at this, I think, and gain things from it, and we can apply it to our lives. Number 18, Paul's run was not with, and he said uncertainty, and I kind of talked about this word a little earlier. In other words, his run isn't an aimless run. I'm not just out running like you throw a 10-year-old out in a cow pasture and tell him to go exercise. So he's just going to run all over the field and have a good time, right? I can remember Mom used to send us out, and this is no lie. It was so calm where I was raised, she could send you out at 10 o'clock, and at about 12 o'clock you'd come back in, and she never stuck her head out the door. After lunch, you went back out, and you had to be home by the time Dad got home. You know. But what we were doing when we were let out, we just ran the fields. We just had a good time, went where we wanted, did what we wanted. The Christian life is not like that. There is an aim, there is a purpose, there is a goal. Much like it is for the runner in a physical race, the goal is to come in and win. As individuals, that should be all of our goals. And so the word uncertainty, which implies aimless, goes in there. Nor did he fight as one that beateth the air. Kind of talked about that, I think, a minute ago. I referred to it as perhaps shadow boxing. You know how boxers do that, limbering themselves up, getting themselves ready with no opponent in front of them. Well, Paul says there is an opponent. There is a fight that I'm fighting for. Any comments? Okay. Got about 1 minute. See if we can get through the true and false questions. True or false? Paul spoke of 2 different crowns in this chapter. True. He did. He talked about the perishable and the unperishable, corruptible or incorruptible. Paul taught that even a preacher could preach the gospel faithfully, but still be lost if he failed to discipline himself. Is that true? Okay. It is true. Verse 25 teaches self-discipline. True. The law of Moses said that thou shalt not muzzle the ox, the mouth of the ox that treadeth out its corn, and that's true. Paul often complained to the brethren because he did not have powers and rights of the other apostles. No, he did not complain. That wasn't what he was doing. That's false. The Apostle Paul had never seen Jesus. So that's a false statement. Acts 22, verse 14, verse 15, verse 16 show that he did. The Corinthians were Paul's work of the Lord. Verse 1 states that's a true statement. Paul wanted to make the gospel of Christ without charge to the hearers. True statement, verse 12. It would have been wrong for Paul to take support of any kind for his preaching. That's false. Paul had that right. It was not a true statement. And then finally, Paul said that he became all things to all men, that he might by all means save some. And indeed that's a true statement. Next week, Paul deals with idolatry to quite a great extent. If you haven't yet, get an opportunity or take the opportunity to look at that chapter before we come back next week. Chapter 10 is where we'll begin when we come back.